Gurdjieff said that you could ask someone to sacrifice any pleasure, and they'd probably do it, but ask them to sacrifice their suffering, and you're asking the impossible. The problem with Gurdjieff is he makes it sound like somebody can just decide to sacrifice their suffering. It doesn't work like that. Hopefully you'll have some view on that by the end of this podcast. But it is a fact that you probably know, and I certainly know, people who are addicted to their state of misery. And you know, if you've listened to other podcasts that I've done, you'll see that I talk fairly frequently about the nature of life. We all die. Things have to eat other things to exist. It's what I've called at various times a shit show. But does this mean that we have to suffer? No, it doesn't actually. And again, this is very, very difficult to explain, but hopefully you'll get the gist of it by the end. So, suffering, let's talk about suffering. Suffering is always associated with a lack of power. Some kind of diminishing of power. And typically the power that we're talking about is the power to exist. So, typical examples. If you become ill, lose a lot of money, lose someone who's close to you, all of those things will cause you pain because they diminish you. They diminish your power. If you lose someone you're close to, then you're close to them because you both enjoyed a lot of things together. All of a sudden that pleasure is gone. And you obviously enjoyed that person, and that pleasure is gone. So pain is always associated with a diminishing of the power of existence. That's what pain is. So it would seem odd that people might decide to kind of become addicted to their lack of power. And this is all very subtle, but identifying with your lack of power is one way to get power. And again, hopefully that will become clear later on. So yes, life is kind of futile. We're always looking for a final cause. The purpose of my life is X. What is the point of living if I'm going to die? Because I'm looking for this purpose for being alive. Life doesn't work like that. Life and the universe knows nothing about final causes, as the philosophers would call them. The reasons for being. Human beings even like to try and project a final cause onto God. Oh, well, God created the universe so that blah, blah, blah. Well, the universe doesn't exist for any reason. It just exists. Reasons and purposes are purely human things. The universe doesn't know anything about that kind of thing. So yes, on the one hand life is futile and it's full of pain because we will experience periods of being diminished in our power for existence, illness, lack of money, crappy relationships, whatever. But there's a magical little formula in all of this. And I'm going over this groundwork really before I get to the nature of the addiction to suffering. There's a magical little formula in all of this, and it's quoted by Epictetus probably most powerfully. He said, "The things that we have no control over are no concern of ours." Why would we be interested in things that we have no control over? So, you have no control over the weather today. You may have decided to go, sunbathing or something, and then when you wake up it's raining. Will that piss you off? Well, it might do, but what is the point of getting pissed off about something you have no control over whatsoever? So the famous line is that reason makes no demands contrary to nature. So if we're reasonable people, we will not say, well, I'm going to go sunbathing even though it's pissing it down with rain. That wouldn't be a reasonable thing to do. The reason that I mention this is because when we look at life and all the things that we have no control over, if we focus on those things, we will have a sense of diminished power because we have no control over them. We have no power over them. You have no power over whether you are going to be ill tomorrow or whether you win the lottery tomorrow or whatever it is. You have no control over those things, and so it doesn't make a lot of sense to obsess about them. He says the thing that we should obsess about, the thing that we should put all our attention on, is the thing that we do have control over, which is our understanding and reasoning. We do have some control over that. We don't even have control over our emotions. Now, when it comes to suffering, our society and civilization really has acquired the habit of holding suffering up as some kind of badge of honor. And I can give you a very good example of this. Émile Cioran, who I actually like. I like reading Cioran. He's a 20th century philosopher. He was a pessimist. But that man, he really held up his suffering as a badge of honor. It was the way he got some power. And let me reiterate, all of this, being addicted to suffering, is about power. So Cioran talked endlessly about the meaningless nature of life and the pains of life and all the phony behavior of people and so on and so forth. And even in our art, we hold suffering up as some kind of wonderful thing. So in opera, various dramas and so on, many of them tend to focus on suffering. So operas particularly. Someone has murdered my lover and I'm so distraught and I'm going to seek revenge, blah blah blah. So we kind of, as a society, we kind of like looking at suffering. We like looking at all this painful stuff. So why is it that we are addicted to suffering? Well, it's all about power. A place of suffering for many people is what you might consider to be a safe haven. It's a safe place. So if they're locked away in some kind of behavior where they complain about everything, that complaining will be an attempt to evoke sympathy maybe from other people, which is an attempt to rally up some kind of power. And it's a safe place. They don't feel threatened there. When they're complaining, they feel, well, this is familiar territory, and I don't need to go anywhere else. I'm safe here. I know what this is all about. It's about the world's a shit place, and I'm a victim of it, and I know where I am in that kind of configuration. And you meet people. In fact, my wife met somebody recently who complains endlessly about her relationship with her husband. And if the relationship was that bad, why doesn't she just leave? Well, she doesn't leave because there's finances involved and a whole pile of things. And complaining to people is an attempt to gain their sympathy and for them to reinforce their views. So she's kind of addicted to this suffering. She doesn't really have the courage, and to come out of suffering requires courage. To stay in suffering requires no courage whatsoever. It's the easy place to be. To come out of suffering requires great courage, and it's not something someone can just muster up. Maybe it will take years for a person to get together the courage to pull themselves out of a situation where they're suffering and they are addicted to their suffering. So you'll very often hear of abusive relationships, both for men and women, but particularly for women, I guess, where maybe they are with a violent partner and they stay in the relationship and they suffer. Why? Because they feel safe in that kind of environment. Strange thing, even though they're not safe, they feel safe, it's familiar. So even our addiction to suffering is a survival mechanism. It's us telling ourselves that we are safe in this particular environment, and that we can do all the whining and appeals for sympathy that we want, and maybe we will get some sympathy which will reinforce us a little bit, but basically we are safe in this environment of suffering and complaining. Now, as with everything else, the ability to break this addiction is not some violent action that we commit against ourselves. The way to break the addiction is simply to look at it impartially, without judgment, without the desire to change it. So we look at it and we say to ourselves, oh, here I am again in this situation where I'm whining and complaining about so-and-so, my husband or my partner or my job or whatever, and just acknowledge that here I am, I'm doing this again. And there's a strange thing that we start to gain some kind of understanding, and possibly just as important, some kind of inner power to look at ourselves in a detached way. Because this ability to just be honest about what we are and what we're doing is very, very powerful. We're not talking about changing any kind of behaviors here. We're just talking about looking at them. To try and change them is a violence against yourself. Don't do it. Just look at them. Oh, here I am again, smoking, and I told myself I wasn't going to smoke today. Oh, here I am. Because we're not Superman. We are human beings that are conditioned and programmed, and if we want to somehow gain some kind of freedom from that, then we just literally need to look at it on a fairly regular basis in an impartial and non-judgmental way. What that does in actual fact is it builds up a muscle, and this muscle allows us to become active within ourselves. In fact, the whole essence of the thing here is about being active or passive. When we are identified with our suffering, we are in a passive state. We're just doing what our body and our mind requires of us to feel safe, because that's what we're doing when we identify with our suffering. But the act of looking and the act of thinking, oh yeah, here I am again doing this, oh yeah, I'm doing something else and whatever, puts us in an active state within ourselves. That active state is very, very important. It's the holy grail, to be active within oneself in situations where normally we might be passive and just be addicted to the suffering that we're experiencing. So the secret in all of this is to acknowledge that we are addicted to our suffering, and as Gurdjieff says, most of us would rather change anything, forego any kind of pleasure than try and forego or lose identification with our suffering. Our suffering makes us feel safe. The way out of this is the way out of pretty much everything to do with human existence, is just to look at it. And I make that sound easy. It's simple, but it certainly is not easy. You will find yourself judging and trying to change your behavior. The act of looking, the act of being active within yourself, is the key to it all. It is the holy grail, to be active instead of passive. And in fact, I've just yesterday actually, I wrote a piece on the blog about being active and passive, and I'll put a link below this podcast. Anyway, it's a very difficult topic. To try and summarize it, being identified with your suffering is literally just a default state of trying to be in a place that you are familiar with and that feels safe. And the way out of that is just to look at it, to observe it, and to become active within yourself. And eventually that addiction to the suffering will start to dissolve a little bit, and you'll start to feel more free.